Okay, I don't know if this is common knowledge, but I've recently worked out how to sew the curves around flaps to make sure that they're nice and smooth. So to give you an idea, so what I'm talking about is a flap like this. So this is what I'm currently sewing. So it has a nice little curved rounded edge. And I've recently worked out how to keep that edge nice and straight and make sure that we are working within our seam allowance, because obviously when we're working on curves and we're spinning it, it can get a bit tricky. So these are the two pieces that I had to cut to size. So obviously I haven't cut the curve in. So the reason being is I cut all of my patterns with a cut list. So I cut based off the measurements. So it's easier for me to cut a rectangle instead of cutting the curves as well, especially because I'm going to trim that curve after I've sewn anyway. So I don't bother cutting those curves into my fabric pieces from the pattern. I just cut it as the rectangle per the cut list. And what I have here is the pattern piece for the stabilizer. So this is where it's really important that we have the stabilizer piece. So the stabilizer piece normally, obviously pattern to pattern is different, but for this one in particular, the stabilizer piece is exactly the seam allowance smaller than the actual size. You can see the seam allowance for this pattern is 3/8, so it would have a 3/8 side everywhere. Now what I do is instead of sorry, I have to remember which way this is going. So instead of cutting this and having the curves on this edge, what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm going to draw the stabilizer piece here so that it gives me an actual idea of exactly where my sewing should be. So I'm just going to grab my ruler and I'm going to mark 3/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance, down on the base, because that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to line up the base of the pattern piece to it. And then I'm going to mark the center point as well. So that's the center point. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the stabilizer piece up against there. So that's my seam allowance base and my center point. And then with that there, I'm just going to draw around. So what this does is it gives me a perfect line of where my seam allowance would have been. And then I'm just going to extend that line. So when I go over to the sewing table, I'm able to follow this line and stitch exactly on that line. And that will give me a perfect curve and the perfect bends, exactly as the pattern piece had, but with the seam allowance. Now, if you didn't have a stabilizer piece for the pattern, how would you do it? You could get your ruler and you can measure it and dot it around to have your 3/8 seam allowance all the way around, or whatever your seam allowance is. But obviously it's just that little bit easier if you had a stabilizer piece, and that way you just plop it on and cut it. I'll take you over to a sewing machine to show you how I sew that next. Okay, so I've just brought you over to my sewing machine. So that's the two pieces clipped together, right sides together. And I've got the side that has the marking on the top. So I'm now just going to sew it. I'm just going to make sure that my needle is right down where my line is, so that I'm literally just following that line. Okay, and now we're getting to the corner, which is the bit that we obviously want the line for. So I just like to do it, I like to hand crank it because it's only such a small corner anyway. And that way I can make sure every time my needle goes in, it's going in right where the line is. And next one. There we go, and we're done. So now if I just cut these threads and bring it in to show you, you'll see that I have stitched all of that as a perfect curve. There's no jaggedy edges or anything like that. That could sometimes happen when you're just free flowing it, just because I've pre-drawn that curve in. So that really helps me with achieving perfect corners. So I'll quickly flip this out just so you guys can see what we're working with here. Sorry. This hole is for the snap button, so that's the only reason I'm poking a hole. Otherwise, if you're just doing a normal thing, you wouldn't bother poking the hole. Sorry, I am not good at birthing. I don't know if you've watched any of my other videos, you will know I suck at birthing. Okay. And I just need to get some sort of a poking stick, which in this case is a pen currently, and just poke those corners out nicely. Here you go. But see, now I've got perfectly curved corners. Like, as you can see, this pattern, the curve isn't massive, but got perfectly curved corners. The lines are all flat and it all looks absolutely symmetrical and perfect because I've drawn that line to know exactly where I'm supposed to sew. So that's my little tip and trick there for how to get those perfect corners.